Have you ever wondered why Jews and Arabs, two peoples who share such a close origin, have been in constant conflict? How can something that began thousands of years ago still cause pain, wars, and divisions that affect the Middle East and the entire world? This is not just a territorial or political dispute. It is a deeply spiritual conflict rooted in promises made by God and in historical events that have shaped the destiny of these nations. Understanding these roots not only helps us comprehend the present, but also reveals God's greater plan for the future. In this video, we will explore the biblical origins of this ancient dispute, why the Promised Land is so valuable to both Jews and Arabs, the historical events that have further fueled this rivalry, how religion, politics, and identity make the conflict even more complex, and finally, what the Bible reveals about the future and the hope for peace. But before we begin, be part of this message of transformation. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell. By doing so, you'll help us spread spiritual content to more people. Now, get ready to dive into a story that connects the past to the future, as we discover how it all began. To understand the conflict between Jews and Arabs, we need to go back to the story of Abraham, recorded in the Bible. He is recognized as the spiritual patriarch of both Jews and Arabs, a man who received a powerful promise from God. In Genesis 12:2-3, God said to Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." But this promise of blessing became the foundation of one of history's greatest disputes, because Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, son of Hagar, his Egyptian servant, Isaac, son of Sarah, his wife. In Genesis 17:19-21, God confirmed that his covenant would be fulfilled through Isaac. However, he also promised that Ishmael would become a great nation. This is the origin of two lineages that to this day dispute God's promises. The descendants of Isaac, who became the Jewish people, the descendants of Ishmael, who formed the Arab tribes. A deeply spiritual conflict. This rivalry is not merely political or territorial. Both peoples believe they have a divine right to the Promised Land and God's blessings. Therefore, this conflict is not just about physical space. It is a spiritual battle deeply rooted in issues of identity and faith. The cunning Apostle Paul, in Galatians 4:22-31, offers a spiritual interpretation of this rivalry. He explains that Ishmael symbolizes the Old Covenant, based on slavery and the law, while Isaac represents the New Covenant, based on freedom and the promise of Christ. This perspective helps us understand that the conflict is tied to God's greater plan for humanity's redemption. Now that we know the spiritual roots of this conflict, let's explore the next question. Why is the Promised Land at the heart of this dispute? If there's one central point in this centuries-old conflict, it's the Promised Land. But why is this region so important to both Jews and Arabs? To understand, we need to dive into the profound spiritual and historical significance of this piece of land. One, God's promise, an eternal covenant. The importance of the Promised Land begins with a promise God made to Abraham. In Genesis 15:18, God declared, "On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates.'" This promise was reaffirmed to Isaac and later to Jacob, who was also called Israel. Since then, the land of Israel has become a symbol of God's promises and the special relationship between him and the Jewish people. However, this land is also significant to Arabs, especially Muslims. Many believe that Ishmael, not Isaac, is the true heir to the promises made to Abraham. This puts the Promised Land at the center of a spiritual dispute where both sides claim rights based on faith and history, a place of unique spiritual connection. The Promised Land is more than just a geographical location. It is viewed as a point of connection between heaven and earth. For the Jews, it is the place where the temple was built, the dwelling place of God among men. They pray facing Jerusalem, and they believe it is where biblical prophecies will be fulfilled. For Arab Muslims, Jerusalem is equally sacred. They believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven from the Dome of the Rock, located on the Temple Mount. This spiritual connection makes Jerusalem, in particular, a convergence point of emotions and significance, essential to both Jews and Arabs. The most contested land in history. Over the centuries, Israel and Jerusalem have been invaded and disputed by countless empires: Romans, Byzantines, Muslims, Crusaders, Ottomans, the British, and more. Each of these periods left deep marks on the land and its people. In 1948, the establishment of the modern State of Israel added a new dimension to the conflict, as Arab Palestinians began to claim the land as their own. This dispute is not just about borders. It represents a struggle for survival, identity, and divine promise for both peoples. 4. Why is peace so difficult? The answer lies in the profound spiritual significance of this land for both sides. For Jews and Arabs, giving up Israel or Jerusalem would be like betraying their roots, their history, and most importantly, their faith. This is why any attempt at a political solution faces enormous barriers. The Promised Land is not just a territory, it is the center of a spiritual battle that transcends the physical world. The Bible warns us about this in Zechariah 12:3. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves. This dispute, which seems impossible to resolve, is part of something much greater, the fulfillment of God's plan for history. Now that we understand why the Promised Land is so central to this conflict, let's explore how recent historical events have further intensified this rivalry. The conflict between Jews and Arabs grew even more intense in the 20th century, when historical events, persecution, and political decisions turned this ancient rivalry into one of the most pressing global issues of our time: the return to the Promised Land. The Zionist movement. For centuries, the Jewish people dreamed of returning to the land of their ancestors. After the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, the Jewish people were dispersed across the world, living as minorities in foreign nations. This dispersion, known as the Jewish diaspora, exposed the Jewish community to centuries of persecution, including massacres and expulsions. In the late 19th century, this desire to return to the Promised Land gave birth to the Zionist movement, led by figures such as Theodor Herzl. Zionism had a clear goal: to rebuild a national home for the Jewish people, where they could live in security and dignity. This movement was not just political, it was also deeply spiritual, inspired by biblical promises such as Ezekiel 37:21, where God declares, "I will gather the Israelites from among the nations where they have gone, and I will bring them back into their own land." 2. The Holocaust and the need for a safe homeland. The urgency of the Zionist movement increased after World War II. The Holocaust, led by the Nazi regime, resulted in the extermination of 6 million Jews. This catastrophic event not only devastated Jewish families and communities, but also highlighted the urgent need for a safe homeland for the Jewish people. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan to divide Palestine into 2 states, a Jewish state, an Arab state. Jerusalem would be an international city under neutral control. The Jews accepted the plan with hope, but the Arabs rejected it, seeing it as an injustice and a foreign invasion of their lands. 3. The creation of the State of Israel and the First War on May 14, 1948, the modern State of Israel was declared. The very next day, neighboring Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, declared war on Israel. This was the first of many wars in the Middle East. The War of Independence, 1948. Despite being outnumbered, Israel emerged victorious and expanded its territory. The Six-Day War, 1967. Israel captured key territories, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and other strategic areas, consolidating its position. The Yom Kippur War, 1973. another conflict that solidified the rivalry between Israel and its Arab neighbors. These wars were traumatic for both sides. While Jews saw them as a fight for survival, Arabs viewed them as humiliating losses and injustices. 4. The refugee crisis. The creation of Israel displaced approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, leading to the so-called Palestinian question. Many of these Palestinians and their descendants still live in refugee camps, holding on to the dream of returning to their homeland. At the same time, many Jews living in Arab countries faced persecution and were forced to flee, seeking refuge in Israel. This forced exchange of populations created an atmosphere of mutual distrust and resentment that persists to this day. 5. Jerusalem, the most sensitive point. If there's one place that symbolizes this rivalry, it's Jerusalem. For Jews, it is their eternal capital promised by God, the center of their spiritual identity. For Arabs, particularly Muslims, Jerusalem is a sacred city tied to the tradition of Muhammad's ascension to heaven. This dispute over Jerusalem was prophesied in the Bible in Zechariah 12:2-3. I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves. Today, Jerusalem remains the most controversial issue in any peace negotiations. Dividing or sharing the city is seen as unthinkable by both sides, as it represents the heart of their beliefs and identities. A conflict more complex than ever, the historical events of the 20th century transformed the conflict between Jews and Arabs into something far more complex than a simple territorial dispute. It now involves issues of survival, justice, religion, and identity, making peace an increasingly elusive goal. In the next chapter, we will explore a crucial question. Is the conflict about religion, politics, or both? The conflict between Jews and Arabs is often described as a political or territorial issue. However, when we look closer, we see that it goes far beyond that. Religion, identity, and politics are deeply intertwined, making this dispute extraordinarily complex and seemingly unsolvable. 1. Religion, the foundation of the conflict. At the heart of this conflict lies spirituality. Both Jews and Arabs consider the Promised Land sacred and essential to their religious identity. For the Jews, Israel is the land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as written in Genesis 17:8. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. It is where the Temple of Solomon was built, the holiest site in Judaism. For Arab Muslims, Jerusalem is equally significant. They believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven from the Dome of the Rock, located on the Temple Mount. For this reason, Jerusalem is considered the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. This spiritual connection makes the land much more than a simple piece of territory. It is an extension of the faith and heritage of both peoples. Politics, the escalating factor. While religion is the foundation, politics has made the conflict even more complex. The establishment of Israel, 1948, supported by Western powers such as the United States and the United Kingdom, was seen by Arabs as a foreign imposition. Many Arabs view Israel as a colonial occupation in lands that were historically Palestinian. The role of neighboring nations, countries like Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, have often used the conflict as a political tool, keeping it active to justify internal actions and strengthen their regional influence. On the other hand, Israel argues that its existence is a matter of survival, especially after centuries of persecution and the trauma of the Holocaust. 3. Identity. Two peoples, two narratives. Another key aspect of the conflict is the question of national identity. Jews and Palestinians hold conflicting historical narratives that underpin their claims. The Jews believe they are returning to their ancestral land, fulfilling God's promises and restoring their identity as the chosen people. The Palestinians believe they were unjustly expelled from their lands and now live under occupation. For them, the fight for Israel is a fight for justice and survival. These narratives clash, creating an impasse for each side, giving up their beliefs and claims feels like betraying their history and identity. 4. Why does peace seem impossible? The combination of religion, politics, and identity creates barriers that make the conflict almost impossible to resolve. Some of the main challenges include Jerusalem. Dividing or sharing Jerusalem is practically impossible, as both sides consider it central to their faith. Extremism. On both sides, radical groups reject any form of compromise. On the Arab side, groups like Hamas refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist. On the Jewish side, there are movements that advocate for the complete annexation of Palestinian territories. The Bible warns us about this in Zechariah 12:2. I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. This prophecy reflects the current reality, where Jerusalem has become a point of division on a global scale. 5. Religion and politics. A spiritual and earthly battle. Ultimately, it is impossible to separate religion from politics in this conflict. The land represents both the spiritual heritage and the political interests of both sides. This connection between the spiritual and the earthly makes the issue far deeper and harder to resolve than any other political conflict in the world. The role of Scripture in the conflict. The Bible gives us a clear perspective. This is a conflict that goes beyond human control. In Zechariah 12:3, we read, "On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." This struggle will only be resolved when God's plan is fulfilled, as we will see in the next chapter, where we discuss the hope for peace and what the Bible reveals about the end of this conflict. In the face of so much pain, wars, and divisions, an inevitable question arises. Is there hope for peace between Jews and Arabs? According to the Bible, the answer goes far beyond political treaties or human initiatives. True peace will only come when God's plan for humanity is fulfilled. 1. True peace comes from God. The Bible teaches that true peace cannot be achieved through political agreements or human strength, but only through divine intervention. In Psalm 122:6, we are called to pray for Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure. However, this peace is directly tied to the fulfillment of God's plans and the coming of Christ's kingdom. What we see today, the conflict, division, and pain, is only part of a much greater story. God's plan to redeem humanity and restore all things. The role of Israel in God's plan. Israel plays a central role in God's plan for the future. The Bible reveals that in the last days, Jerusalem will be at the center of global events. In Zechariah 14:2-4, it is written that Jerusalem will be surrounded by enemies, but the Lord will intervene. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Additionally, in Matthew 24:6-7, Jesus spoke about wars and rumors of wars, saying that nations would rise against nations, something we already see unfolding in the Middle East. These passages remind us that God has not forgotten his promises, and that he is guiding history toward the fulfillment of his sovereign plan, the promise of reconciliation. Despite the conflict, the Bible also points to a future of reconciliation between the nations. In Isaiah 19:24-25, we find a surprising promise. In that day, Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance." This reveals that God has a plan for unity, where Jews, Arabs, and all nations will be reconciled under his sovereignty. This vision of unity and worship is a message of hope that transcends the current conflict. The return of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, ultimate peace, will only be achieved with the return of Jesus Christ. He is described in Isaiah 9:6 as the Prince of Peace, the one who will establish an eternal kingdom of justice and reconciliation. When Christ returns, he will end all divisions and conflicts, turning pain into joy and war into peace. In Revelation 21:4, we see God's final promise. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. This is the future that God has promised, a future where there will be no more wars, and where all nations, including Jews and Arabs, will live in harmony under the reign of Christ. 5. Our role in God's plan. While we wait for these promises to be fulfilled, God calls us to be peacemakers. In Matthew 5:9, Jesus reminds us, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." As followers of Christ, we are called to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and for reconciliation between Jews and Arabs. Share the love of Jesus, the only true source of peace. Live as instruments of peace, promoting empathy and understanding in a divided world. In Ephesians 2:14, we read, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." This message challenges us to trust in God's plan and to be witnesses of his peace while we await Christ's return. Peace in the Middle East may seem impossible by human hands, but the Bible assures us that God is in control. He has already planned the day when all pain and division will be replaced with joy and reconciliation. Until then, we are called to pray, trust, and be a light in the darkness, proclaiming the message of the Prince of Peace to the world. The conflict between Jews and Arabs goes far beyond a territorial or political dispute. It is deeply rooted in spiritual, historical, and identity issues. It is a struggle that began with a promise made by God to Abraham and, to this day, reverberates across the world, causing division and suffering. Throughout this video, we explored the biblical roots of the conflict, which trace back to the lineages of Ishmael and Isaac, the spiritual significance of the Promised Land, which makes it the heart of the dispute, the historical events that intensified the rivalry, including the creation of the State of Israel and the wars that followed, how religion, politics, and identity are intertwined, making the conflict even more complex. And finally, the hope for reconciliation and peace promised by God, which will be fully realized with the return of Christ. Final reflection, our role as Christians. But what does all of this mean for us? As Christians, we are called not only to understand this conflict, but also to act according to God's plan. The Bible reminds us that we are ambassadors of peace and light in the midst of darkness. Therefore, I invite you to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and for all the people involved in this conflict. Ask God to transform hearts and bring reconciliation, for only He can offer true peace. Study the Word of God to understand His divine plan and strengthen your faith. The Bible provides clarity about the past, the present, and the future. Share this message, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and send it to your friends and family. The more people understand the spiritual and historical roots of this conflict, the greater the empathy and search for solutions will be. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe peace between Jews and Arabs is possible? Which part of this video impacted you the most? Let's continue this conversation and learn together. Final message. God is in control. Even amidst so much suffering and uncertainty, we must remember an unshakable truth. God is in control of history. He promised in His word that all things will be restored, and that Jerusalem, today a symbol of dispute, will one day become an eternal symbol of peace and glory. In Revelation 21:4 we read, "He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." So trust in God's divine plan and continue to be an instrument of peace. Let us act with love and faith as we await the return of the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. The Lord gives strength to His people. The Lord blesses His people with peace. Psalm 29:11.